Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
Welcome to General Quarters. We appreciate you joining us today. If you're a veteran and would like to be on our show and share your story, please email me at generalquarterspodcast@gmail.com. I am honored to have James Hornfischer, my favorite storyteller and New York Times best-selling author, with us today. Jim is a fellow Massachusetts native, and we get the opportunity to pick up our interview with him as he begins discussing his journey to work and write about the war in the Pacific.
And in the course of my studies, I ended up going to the Naval Academy, not to do anything related toward a naval career, but to participate in the Collegiate Foreign Affairs Conference. But I pulled up short of pursuing a naval career. It was either because I wasn't pain tolerant enough to get through, basic training, or, all the standard military abuse, or it was because I read a book that set me on a very different course, and that book turned me toward book publishing. And so when I got out of school, I went straight to New York, and I had the same problem you did with New York City. It was just after the Red Sox lost to the Mets, and it was a bitter pill.
Yes, it was a bitter pill. Yeah.
But I found in book publishing license to sort of circle back to interests and obsessions that I had when I was much younger. And so growing up in Amherst, some kids in the neighborhood and I really we're all into building model ships and aircraft. We're also into wargaming, nothing like you find online today, or these super accurate simulations. These would be Avalon Hill hex map games. I'm sure you're familiar with that type of entertainment. And all the while, I just found myself fascinated from the totality of these experiences, also including the very formative experience of watching Baba Black Sheep on NBC on Thursday nights for 2 years, the F-4U Corsair peeling off to attack a Japanese fighter in the South Pacific. My buddies and I couldn't get enough of that. So by the time I got to my early professional career, I had to circle back to all this, because in college, in the liberal arts, they don't let you study military science as such, unless you go to a handful of certain universities that support it. Mm-hmm. And so at Colgate, I studied national security studies, and but book publishing, as I started to say, was a license to kind of circle back to these earlier life interests, which were powerful. Yeah, so I had the good fortune of working, starting my career at McGraw-Hill, where the editor-in-chief had published Gordon Prang, had published any number of really incredible American heritage histories of World War II and other subjects. So I kind of found I found an employer who was very interested in history, and my my early life, the knowledge gained early in life on the Pacific War, turned out to have some application.
That's, it's funny. My love for the Navy, for the sea. I grew up in the South Shore and spent a lot of time, the Cape, the islands, also up in New Hampshire on the lakes there. But what really I think turned the corner for me was the movie Midway. I was just a little too young for Tora, 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 I guess, when that first came out, which obviously half the clips in Midway came from that movie as I got older. And that drew me in. And then, from that point of watching that movie, then I couldn't get enough reading about the Navy history, all of World War II, but always kind of drifted back to the war in the Pacific. And, I think that's obviously, when you published your first book, it was just incredible. And, one of the things that I would describe your writing is that you're a storyteller, right? I mean, it's not when you write, you really feel like you're in the present. And I think you have that right mix of telling the story, but giving enough of the history piece of it so that it all comes together, and you feel like you've lived the entire adventure, and that's quite a knack. And I was wondering, was there an author that you followed that had that skill set? Was it a skill set you worked to develop, or was it just natural for you?
It was through my, I don't know, I've always had a certain level of ability with written expression, I guess, coming up in school. And, that's a tool set that you can deploy. It needs motivation to do it well. And my motivation was, I really wish I had been there. I really wish I had been in the Pacific to witness these epic events. The whole thing is sort of this heavy metal epic, from Pearl Harbor all the way to the Third Fleet entering Tokyo Bay. And having grown up building all these models and playing these war games, it was left to my imagination to picture it all. And fascinated as I was by these campaigns, it was a sort of it wasn't an intellectual interest necessarily. It was more of a sympathetic fascination with what it must have looked like, what it must have been like. And so as I started using my writing skills to kind of bring the reader into, the subject of my first book is the Battle off Samar, which was basically the greatest upset victory in the history of naval warfare. I really wanted to make readers feel like they were there. And the way I would do that was to gain the experience for myself that I was there. Mm-hmm. And I would get that state, before I wrote it up, I'd get that state through research, through not only interviews with the veterans who at the time were still having very robust reunions, but through, deep dives at the National Archives and the Naval Historical Center, reading oral histories, and conducting photo research at this absolutely peerless facility up at National Archives 2 at College Park. All the photos from World War II are there, available by card catalog. They wheel out the hand truck and they bring you all these great photos. And you begin to picture, at least I was able, through that, I was able to fool myself almost that I'd been there by seeing the shell splashes rising up around the Gambier Bay, by watching the 5-inch guns, fire. And so combining all the source material and combining the personal accounts, it became just sort of a writing trick to decide when to shift point of view, where to go. I felt like a movie director with a camera almost. And I was able thereby to fool myself into thinking almost that I'd been there. And I think once I fooled myself and managed to get that on the page, that's what carries readers along finally. But I go back to saying it's not academic or intellectual interest. It was really just this ability to kind of project the imagination into the past based on this kind of weird, maybe even perverse wish that I'd been there. God knows it was horrible.
Yeah, and at the same time, horrible, heroic, I guess are two terms that go together when you talk about these types of events. And so that yearning to be a part of it, and like I said before, that's kind of what drove me to want to serve in the Navy, and as long as I did. But as soon as you get on a small ship, like a frigate or something along those lines, and you're in a bunk and you hear the waves crashing on the deck above you, it does hit you very quickly that it is a horrible environment to be if you're being attacked or in the middle of something. It's just it's a real awakening. But everything you said, so effectively translated, I think, for the readers, and it's been, anyone who's read your books that I talk to, it instantly starts off with, it was just incredible. It was like being there. One of my favorite authors, because, I speak and talk to people that I served with or other veterans and so forth, which is generally, who we interview and we talk to. And, it's just fascinating to hear how this all came about. But it must be pretty gratifying to know that it really pays off, because you learn so much. But it's like if courses in history could be taught the way you write a book, man, I think people would really want to dive in more and learn more, because it's so exciting and it's so compelling.
Well, most of us who are doing this aren't academic historians, and this this tradition of the narrative storyteller. I wear two hats. I continue to work in publishing, and the writing has been an outgrowth of my publishing industry work, and so I'm very mindful of everything else that's happening in the industry, what other authors are working on what, and how they're working, and how their books are received. And so I pay pretty close attention to other books and other authors. And the commonality I see is that the vast majority of the most popular military writers are not academics. They're geeks like me. They found some kind of interest that became emotional at an early age. And they use narrative writing style to carry the reader along. I think if you take that writing style into the typical university history department, you're going to be fairly quickly dismissed in most cases, because they're, sadly, and frankly, Victor Davis Hanson wrote a devastating piece about the state of history in academia today. It's your listeners will find it on the web rather easily. I think it was published in the National Review. Hanson, just kind of laments the specialization of academic history, and the idea that it gets into politics to the extent that love of country is very unfashionable in academia and history departments, in most places. Again, the majority. I'm not saying all by any stretch, but
sure,
it's a predominant ethos of the academic historian to specialize more than anything else. And so the idea of specialty means your audience is decreasing and narrowing. And the historians who are finding the wide audiences are the narrative historians who are into storytelling. And if you can combine storytelling with original research and come up with things that really discerning readers like yourself haven't seen in 10 other books, you might just end up having a career doing this stuff, And so it's a very inefficient process, because it requires you to do a lot of research that never sees print, ends up on the cutting room floor. I did so many interviews that I never ended up using. I was, in some of those reunions that took place after the books were published, felt guilty to see a family. Maybe I cut, maybe grandpa ended up on the cutting room floor, but the point is you have to immerse yourself in this world and then bring it to life on the page. And that's a skill set that tends to be left to the generalists and the non-academic writers like me than it does to the academic historians who are increasingly specialized in their interest, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And that makes a lot of sense. And I guess really understand, how that all comes together. It sounds it doesn't sound very complicated, but I can only imagine putting all these pieces together, like you said, putting together a film, so that it all flows well and keeps people captivated, is, like I said, it's a real talent, and it's funny because, we definitely appreciate people that have skill sets that others don't possess, that you wish you did. And I think that's how I feel when I read your books is, you see something like this, a lot of the history already. And then when you get into it, you say, man, I wish I had this ability, not in an envious way, but just in an incredible, like, man, this just works. Because, I read a lot of other books and authors and so forth. And when you start reading books that try to put that narrative together the same way, but, it goes back 100 or 200 years in history, well, there's a lot of, I guess, free flow and a lot of conjecture. It's not exactly as accurate, right? I'm trying to think.
You want to work
a lot of assumptions. Yeah.
From primary source material where possible. And as you've had a long naval career, and I'm willing to guess that you've written your share of reports,
right,
in the course of your career. And when you arrange these reports in front of you, especially when they concern something as momentous as, say, one of the naval battles fought down at Guadalcanal in 1942, it's rather intense. There's a lot of intense, bloody detail, and there's a lot of analysis of what went wrong, and there are personal accounts of gallantry, and there are details. Any number of the Navy is so good at quantifying everything that happens, right?
Yeah.
The number of shells fired, the hits taken, the